Folks, if you weren't aware of it, I am black. And more than that, I believe that I am a fairly intelligent person. I believe that I am a fairly analytical person. And I came across a couple of things that weighed on my mind, and I normally, don't do a lot of sleeping. I'm up, I move around, I consider the events of the day, and I also consider not only my own personal history, but the history of my people, which brings to mind a saying from a person who I believe is a friend, though I've never ever met him or even spoken to him on the phone. Know your history and control your dollar. That particular saying is something that Mr. Superboy 223 is constantly harping on, and he is absolutely right. Now, I considered the length of the video that you're about to see, and I understand that people's attention spans are not that lengthy. It's been proven that when speaking on a subject, the longest that you should talk about it should be 30 minutes or less, because the average person's ability to retain the information that you provide to them basically cuts off right around the 30-minute mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break what should be one video up into 3 so that you can take in the information and hopefully retain it. Watch the next video, take in that information, hopefully retain it, and then take in the third video and hopefully retain that information. Put all 3 of them together in your minds and come to what I believe is a valid conclusion. But obviously, it's up to you to arrive at your own destination. Now, the first portion or first video I'm going to make concerns the black community and black wealth. The second has to do with black employment, and the third has to do with black identity. The first video, which is this one, will deal with the past. The second, the present, and the third, potentially, the future. Okay, I saw a clip from the Roland Martin show, which I'm going to play in a moment, which has to do with black wealth and historically why the black community was not able to amass any large amount of black wealth. Here is the video.
Wealth disparity is a huge issue in this country. We often talk about it here on this show. And new U.S. Census data from 2013 shows how stark the issue is among whites in America. The average wealth in the United States is about $130,000. Of course, Hispanics at around $12,000, and blacks just under $10,000. Asian Americans come in second to whites in this country. This speaks to largely the issue of home ownership. Of course, as we talked about over the last 8 years, 53% of all black wealth was wiped out due to the home foreclosure crisis. Also, African Americans are more or less likely to invest in stocks and bonds as well. Now again, looking at the numbers for the total number for whites in America, not Hispanic, $132,483. For Asian Americans is $112,250. For Hispanics, 460. For African Americans, 9,211. Now, broken down by the net worth minus the equity in their homes, African Americans fare the worst. According to the Census Bureau, whites averaging just under $51,000, Hispanics at almost $6,000, and African Americans at under $3,000. Now, the reason this is important, because when you begin to talk about also the expanding of businesses, as we have reported on this show over the last 4 years, when $23.09 billion was handed out in small business loans in 2013, African Americans received just $385 million of that, less than 2%, largely because of the loss of homes. Very simple. No home, no loan, no business. Let's talk about this, of course, with our panel there in Washington, D.C. Don Calloway, he is the CEO of Pine Street Strategies. Lauren Victoria Burke, political analyst and writer for NBC Black. Eugene Craig, CEO of the Eugene Craig Organization. So, folks, what really jumps out when we look at this Census Bureau data, Pew Research also follows up with this as well. You really have a better understanding in terms of how far African Americans are behind everyone else when it comes to economics in this country.
Absolutely, Roland. You know, as you pointed out earlier, with the housing crisis and the loss of homes, you know, people, they lost their number one asset. You know, in America, everyone's number one asset is their home and the equity within that home. And once you lose that equity, you lose that home, you lose your number one asset, you lose that net worth. And that's what's happened to Black America over the last couple of years, last decade or so.
Exactly. It hasn't been a help at all that our politicians really have no policy, frankly, for poverty. President Obama rarely talked about poverty, didn't care about the issue, never spoke on it. Currently, obviously, Donald Trump doesn't talk about poverty. We have 1 in every 7 Americans in poverty, over 40 million people. It wasn't helpful that President Obama paid no attention to the Bush tax cut rates and effectively turned down $4 trillion over 10 years in revenue with the fiscal cliff deal and with the extension of the Bush tax cuts in late 2010. But even without that, he has no policy for poverty, but neither do the Republicans. Our 3 poorest states, Arkansas, West Virginia, and Mississippi, are run by the Republican Party, and they have no policy for poverty.
And Roland, a big part of the problem here is that it's not a sexy thing electorally to talk about the poor and talk about the idea of poverty. We're very much caught up on both sides of the political spectrum in talking about the middle class and advancing the middle class. Of course, nobody is really talking about the wealthy, although our policies tend to...
Yeah, but Don, here's the issue, though. Even, look, I understand in terms of talking about those who are in poverty when we talk about the wealth gap. But even when it came to the home foreclosure crisis, the middle class, the Black middle class, was the one that hit the hardest because there really is no comparison between Black middle class and white middle class because it's a whole different distinction because of the amount of money being made. And so the issue I think you also have here is that you have a rollback of various affirmative action programs and also programs that were all about equalizing, when it came to access to capital, access to contracts. And so when you roll those back, you also make it even more difficult to be able to grow and expand businesses.
There's no doubt about that, and a lot of that, what we consider to be, folks on the right electorally score points by saying that these are currently new discriminatory policies. It's not. It's a recognition that there are real and tangible effects from historical injustices such as bank loaning and discriminatory bank loan lending practices and redlining that still exist today. And the 2008 housing crisis has made it worse. Even right here in Maryland, where you have the richest, per se, African-American population in the country, their housing stock has not come anywhere close to recovering at the rate of the normal rate that we've seen in the recovery across this country. So there are substantial elements to talk about here, not only in the universe of those in poverty, but actually those in the African-American middle class who have fallen over the last 10 years because of the housing crisis.
Well, also I think, Eugene, one of the issues that when you look at economic policies on the local level, the reality is if you look to Washington, D.C., you're going to fail. If you look at what Maynard Jackson did in Atlanta, Marion Barry in Washington, D.C., Coleman Young in Detroit, you had a slew of Black mayors in the early 70s who understood how politics and economics combines. Look, the reality is you have not seen that in Memphis since the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The same thing can be said about other cities as well. And so I think we also have to look at what are those very specific policies on the local level on the state level in how they also do not, frankly, decrease this wealth gap?
Well, absolutely. You know, Washington can't solve the issues in mainstream America. That's been something that's been proven time and time again. You know, Barack Obama would, you know, he couldn't solve the issue, and Donald Trump's not going to be able to solve the issue. The issue of poverty is a localized issue and has to be dealt with on a local level. The federal government can do things like block grant, provide block grants and other types of funding, but at the end of the day, the solution is going to have to come from that local community, from that local government.
I'm gonna respectfully disagree a little bit here, Eugene, because when you have the one per se anti-poverty agency we have, which is the Housing and Urban Development Agency, run by a guy who says that poverty is a myth or it's a state of mind, that's a per se problem. Their one mission is to eradicate poverty or help to eradicate poverty through the proliferation of affordable housing. And for someone to say that poverty is a fiction, running that department, also, by the way, with a brain surgeon, a pediatric neurosurgeon with no relevant experience whatsoever in poverty issues or affordable housing issues, this is the one agency that could possibly do something on the federal level.
I'm going to push back on that. I think the number one aspect that Ben Carson brought to that agency is the fact that he spent his time, energy, and resources over the years actually dealing with poverty on the local level.
I know other things. Come on, man. That's
the first point. That's first thing. Secondly, Carson Fowler. Secondly,
Okay, 1 second.
How many
Okay, hold on. Okay, hold on.
Secondly-
Guys, all three cannot talk at one time. Eugene, finish your comment.
Secondly,
We'll go to my next question.
when it comes to dealing with poverty and economic growth in this country, there's no greater economic driver than growth and jobs. And the Republicans are right on the policy when it comes to developing growth, developing business, developing jobs for this country.
Yeah, like, what is your example?
Well,
Where's your
Look at
example?
Well, again, you can say,
Give an example.
Look at what's going on in Baltimore.
Eugene.
Look at what's going on in Virginia with the 500 companies.
1 second, Eugene,
Look at what's going on in
you can make
California
your
to
point.
Texas.
Eugene, first of all, let me be clear. The three of y'all, when I'm talking, I need everybody to stop. Okay, that's first. You can talk about the whole deal in terms of driving economic and jobs, but if you don't have economic policies that impact the folks at the bottom, what you just said is utterly irrelevant. Speaking of the issue of jobs, that's one of the reasons why President Donald Trump says America is pulling out of the Paris Accord.
Okay, now that you've seen the video, you can see the position that the black community is in relation to the Hispanic communities, Asian communities, and the Caucasian communities. And there is a reason for that. If you weren't aware of it, the average person's wealth is based generationally. What does that mean? It means that your parents and grandparents basically were able to pass wealth down to you in the form of an inheritance. Their house that they paid for, that was passed down to you, life insurance policies of decent to significant amounts that you were made a beneficiary of, etc. Now, this differs greatly from community to community, and I'm basically going to concentrate on the black community versus the Caucasian community. Most of the wealth, and I'm not talking about the billionaires, et cetera, though they come into play as well. Most of the wealth that the middle class person of Caucasian descent has amassed has come through the inheritance of the home or property of their parent. Now, the same cannot be said for, excuse me, the black community. If you weren't aware of it, there were laws, especially in the South, that prohibited, that would not allow a black person to inherit property, money, or anything else from their parent. So any wealth that was amassed by a person over the past, I would say up to the 1960s, you basically were not allowed to pass on. Now, you could mess around if you wanted to, and before you died, sell your home and obtain the cash, and then salt that cash away, and your progeny obviously would have access to the cash. But that, for the most part, didn't happen for a variety of reasons. Whereas in the Caucasian community, this was just a normal happenstance. That changed somewhat in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, where black people were able to, in my opinion, for the first time, be able to pass wealth down to their children. So you saw the black community begin to rise from the 60s through the 90s into the 2000s. Now remember, we still have large amounts of unemployment, but things got a little bit better for quite a few black people. And that was because of the battles that were fought in the 60s and into the 70s. And again, not all the battles were won. And I'll go into that in the second video. But a lot of battles were won, and we started coming up. All of that came crashing down in the 2000s, and in particular, 2008 during the housing crisis. Yes, America did suffer a tremendous financial decline because, again, the majority of most people's wealth, as indicated by the video, is centered in their homes. And there were, obviously, in the black community was not a heck of a lot left over in order to invest in stocks, bonds, the stock market, etc. But prior to 2008, people were in a small, and I do mean small, position to leverage the equity that they had in their homes in order to start businesses. And from 1990 to 2005 approximately, there was a large increase in the number of black businesses that were started. 2008 became a wake-up call, and not even so much a wake-up call, it really became a year of despair. Obviously, with the housing market crashing and over $1 trillion of equity being lost just by the black community alone, we were put behind the 8 ball. Now, it didn't help matters much when Obama came in and they created the TARP funding for huge corporations and also injected a tremendous amount of capital into the banking industry, which was supposedly targeted to refi homeowners who had basically been put underwater as far as their mortgages were concerned. Although that amount of money was injected into the banking sector, the banks sat on that money and they made it difficult, if not impossible, for black homeowners to go in and to obtain refinancing of their homes. Now, a particular culprit in all of this is Steve Mnuchin. Mr. Mnuchin took over a bank in Los Angeles, and it was formerly a black-owned bank. The government stepped in took the bank over, then transferred or sold the bank to Mr. Mnuchin at a discount, and Mr. Mnuchin proceeded to lay the hammer down on people of color, and in particular black people. This man foreclosed on hundreds of millions of dollars of mortgages and used practices which I will only describe as immoral in order to seize homes of people who had been in them for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years or more, and had over years refinanced them. So, as you can see, the ability of the black community to amass wealth basically was non-existent. And that is the reason why today the statistics that you saw on the video on News One Now is basically more a reality check and a condemnation of the history of this country, than anything else. Now, the good news is we can do something about it, because we now have the ability, if we choose to be able to pass down the equities that we have in our homes, if we are fortunate enough to have been able to hang on to them or to acquire them. Now, I'm what I believe to be middle class. I say that because I'm retired. I still have a mortgage, which is paid every month, and I can live and do live comfortably. I have the ability to go out and buy pretty much whatever I want within reason. I'm not going out buying planes and yachts and things of that nature, but if the situation arises, I have the ability to hop on a plane same day to a destination on the East Coast or the West Coast and not be concerned about how it will be paid for. And in my mind, if you have that particular ability, then you are not in too bad a shape. As a matter of fact, you are in pretty decent shape, because a lot of people just can't afford to do something like that. So I consider myself middle class. My kids are in good shape. Sorry about that, folks. There you go. I'm sorry. My kids are in good shape, educationally, and I guess economically to some extent, though I still have a couple of them that are living at home, but everybody's gainfully employed, so what are you going to do? We need to concentrate on amassing black wealth. We are behind, obviously, the Caucasians. We're behind the Asians. We're behind the Hispanics. We are in a fourth place, folks. And there's a reason for that, because we have been in this country longer than either of those two groups to any substantial numbers. Now, the Hispanics came in behind us, and obviously they faced discrimination, not to the same level as us, but they faced forms of discrimination, and the Asians came in last. And a lot of the Asians came in with financial resources, and they spread it around and have done very well for themselves. And I'm not angry or upset with them. They did what they had to do, and obviously they were successful. We need to take a good look at the economic and social systems that we live in, we need to understand that we're not just living for ourselves, but we're living for our children and our grandchildren. And we need to leave them in a better place than we were in when we got out into the world. You do that by education. You do that by leaving nest eggs. You do that by giving them goals and aspirations and mentoring so that they understand the system that they live in and can work within it, even though it is leveraged against them. Now, I'm going to end this particular video here. And the next subject that I'm going to bring up is the current state of black employment and what the current administration is doing, or should I say, not going to do, in order to give us a level playing field.